The year is 1789 and France is in the middle of a massive revolution. Citizens are storming the Bastille, beheading the king's wife and marching on Versailles to force the king to sign a constitution. But despite all this chaos, one man is calmly sailing down the River Seine. This man is René Pierre de Laporte, Marquis de Condorcet, a wealthy landowner and politician who has just made a bet that he will be able to get to the port of Jade without getting his feet wet. Now, the flooding was spreading downstream. To make matters even worse, rumors began to spread through the city that British troops were on their way to pillage the undefended capital. The roads were impassable and most of the bridges over the Seine had collapsed. Food and water were in short supply and disease began to spread. Whole neighborhoods had been wiped out and the city was covered in a thick layer of mud. The survivors emerged from their hiding places, dazed and confused. They had no idea what to do next. The city was in ruins and the country was in the middle of a revolution. Even the graveyards were full and the dead were being left in the streets. And high winds, which caused the river to overflow its banks. But there is evidence that climate change may be making the floods worse. This is bad news for the people of Paris, who are already struggling to cope with the effects of climate change. The flooding is not only damaging property and disrupting lives, but it is also costing the city millions of dollars every year. In recent years, the Seine has flooded more frequently and for longer periods of time. And scientists predict that this trend will continue in the future. When I first learned about the flooding, I couldn't believe that it had happened in the middle of the French Revolution. The streets were probably knee-deep in water, the air was thick with the smell of rotting garbage, and the sound of screaming flooded the streets. And then the citizens had to deal with the aftermath. They had to salvage what they could from their waterlogged homes, bury the dead, and try to rebuild their lives. I thought it must have been a huge deal at the time, but it barely made a dent in the historical record. It was a pivotal moment in the history of Paris and it is a story that deserves to be remembered. The people of Paris stormed the Bastille, beheaded Marie Antoinette, and forced the king to sign a constitution. It was truly an extraordinary time and the flooding was just one small part of it. But this is expensive and it is also controversial because it can disrupt the ecosystem of the river. Well, it's probably because it was overshadowed by the other events of the French Revolution. And if you want to support me, please consider becoming a member. With your support, I can continue to make videos about the fascinating history of our world. Until next time, goodbye. They have had to deal with wars, revolutions, and natural disasters. But they have always endured and they have always come back stronger than before. The storming of the Bastille, the reign of terror, and the rise of Napoleon all got more attention than the flooding. But that doesn't mean that the flood wasn't important. Another solution is to restore the natural floodplains of the river. This would allow the water to spread out over a larger area, reducing the risk of flooding in any one particular place. But this would also mean that more land would be permanently underwater. But as time passed, the memory of the flood began to fade. That is until now. Welcome back to my channel. Well, to answer that question, we have to look no further than the River Seine itself. The Seine is the longest river in France, stretching over 700 kilometers from its source in the Dijon region to its mouth at the English Channel. The people of Paris have lived with the threat of flooding for centuries, and they have always found a way to rebuild and recover. But as the climate continues to change, the floods are likely to become more severe. It is up to the people of Paris to find a way to adapt and survive. The river has played an important role in the history of Paris, providing the city with water and serving as a vital transportation route. But the Seine is also a dangerous river. Today, we are going to explore the tragic tale of the night that Paris drowned. In 1910, the river overflowed and killed hundreds of people. And in 1982, the water rose to the highest level ever recorded. But none of these floods can compare to the disaster of May 1789. So what caused it? With each passing day, the outlook grew more grim. But the flooding eventually stopped on May. Soon, almost the entire city was submerged and more than 300 people drowned. Those who survived huddled together in the few buildings that were still standing, praying that the flooding would stop. But no such luck. These rumors weren't entirely true. The British were indeed planning to invade France, but not until 1799. Unfortunately, the people of Paris didn't know that, and they prepared for an imminent attack. A minor miracle considering that Paris is currently knee-deep in the river because the dam at Jot has broken and flooded the entire city. But how did this happen? Well, you're gonna have to let me tell you the story of the night that Paris drowned. The flooding started on the evening of May 2nd when a violent thunderstorm hit Paris, followed by heavy rain throughout the night and into the next day. The people of Paris were used to these kinds of storms. After all, they lived in a valley surrounded by 4 rivers, and the Seine was prone to flooding. However, they had never seen anything like this before. As the water level rose, it became clear that something was wrong. The flooding was so severe that the water began to push up against the barriers built to keep the Seine from overflowing. And sure enough, at around 6 o'clock in the morning on May 4th, those barriers broke and the water poured into the streets. People fled to higher ground, and soon the whole city was underwater. It was the worst flood in the history of Paris, and if that wasn't bad enough, there was worse news to come. In addition to breaking the barriers, the flood also broke the dam at Jot, which was supposed to protect Paris from the waters of the nearby river Yonne. Many fled to the countryside, but there was nowhere for them to go. As the days passed, the water continued to rise and the situation grew increasingly desperate. When the sun finally came out, it revealed a scene of total devastation. And so, Paris began the long and difficult task of rebuilding. Now, I'm sure many of you are wondering why the flooding happened in the first place. Every year, it floods the surrounding areas, causing widespread destruction. Well, the simple answer is climate change. According to historical records, the flooding was the result of unusually heavy rainfall. In fact, a new study found that climate change could cause the Seine to flood up to twice as often by the end of the century. So what can be done to prevent future floods? One solution is to build more dams and levees to control the flow of the river. Ultimately, the best solution is probably a combination of both engineering projects and natural land management. Now, you might be wondering why I chose to talk about the flooding in Paris in the first place. Well, I'll tell you. I tried to imagine what it must have been like to live in Paris in 1789, and yet, despite all this, the revolution continued. So why doesn't anyone remember the Great Flood of 1789? In fact, it is an important reminder of the challenges that the people of Paris have faced throughout history. So the next time you hear someone talking about the French Revolution, be sure to mention the Great Flood of 1789. Thank you for watching my video today. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of my videos.